They said her life was full of tragedy, a best friend lost, a husband gone. But in this quiet town, not every silence is innocent. Subscribe, and let's begin. Eleanor Bryce buried her husband in April. The morning was unreasonably bright, the sky a sharp blue that made the flowers look artificial against the black folds of mourning. She wore a tailored dress that fit her perfectly, understated pearl earrings, and gloves that reached halfway up her forearms. Everything about her was composed, elegant, almost serene. Those who came to the funeral whispered that she carried herself with such dignity, such grace. Even in grief, she seemed untouched by chaos. People in town had always admired Eleanor. She was the kind of woman others wanted to be near, not because she was loud or charming, but because she made you feel like you were part of something refined. She ran the school office like a ship's captain, quiet authority, every detail in order. She never raised her voice, never gossiped, never arrived late or left a task unfinished. Parents trusted her. Children respected her. Other women envied the smoothness of her skin, the poise in her posture, the way her voice stayed calm even when everything else felt frayed. They said she had been beautiful in her youth, and she had. But Eleanor aged like expensive furniture, polished, preserved, and somehow more valuable with time. Her silver hair was always pinned in a soft twist, her clothes chosen with care, but never ostentation. She knew how to disappear into a room and still be noticed. Her marriage had seemed solid from the outside. No one ever heard raised voices from their house, no affairs, no scandal, just the quiet image of enduring partnership. But what people didn't see or chose not to was the way her husband stopped speaking during dinner, how he stared through her, as if she were a photograph on the wall, familiar but no longer alive. They hadn't touched in years. Eleanor never complained. She simply adjusted, the way she always had. She filled her days with structure, her nights with novels and silent cups of tea. She knew how to keep things tidy, externally at least. His death was called an accident. A late-night drive, a sharp curve, an old bridge with no guardrails. They found the car the next morning, nose down in the shallow river. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Just a man who had fallen asleep behind the wheel, they said. A tragedy, but not an unusual one. After the funeral, Eleanor returned to her house and closed the door with a sense of finality. She drew the curtains, made a pot of tea, and sat in her favourite chair by the window. There was no grief in her eyes, only stillness. For the first time in years, the silence in the room did not feel like suffocation. It felt like freedom. She didn't answer the phone that week. Let the casseroles sit untouched on the porch. She walked each room slowly, not to clean, but to reclaim it. Her home was no longer a mausoleum, it was hers again. 7 days later, she opened the mailbox and found a plain white envelope. No name, no return address. The handwriting was crisp, exact, like a teacher's note. Inside, you thought it was gone. But I remember all of it. Eleanor read the words, her face unreadable. Then, with precise hands, she folded the paper once, twice, walked to the fireplace and set it alight. She watched the flame eat through the page, her expression unchanged. She stood there a long time, staring into the fire, the shadows flickering across her face like passing ghosts. The letters arrived every Tuesday without fail. Each one was tucked neatly inside an unmarked white envelope, always folded once, placed precisely in the centre. No handwriting on the outside, no stamps, no return address. It was as if someone had walked right up to her mailbox in the dead of night and slipped them in with surgical care. At first, Eleanor thought it was a prank. Then perhaps the early signs of something unravelling in her mind. But week after week, the letters kept coming, each one more intimate, more invasive than the last. Inside, the notes were never more than a few lines, but they cut deep. The words didn't accuse her directly. There were no threats, no ultimatums, just observations so precise they felt like old memories whispered back at her. You still sleep with your window locked, even in summer, afraid of the dark or afraid of what you might let in. Another note said, 3 sugar cubes in your tea, but you always tell the girls at work it's herbal and unsweetened. Why the lie, Eleanor? And another, more chilling. You still keep her bracelet in the top drawer, beneath the scarves. Funny how you said you gave it to her sister. Whoever wrote them didn't just know facts. They knew her rhythms, her hesitations, her tells. They noticed the tremble in her left hand when she held ceramic mugs, the way her voice softened just slightly when she was about to shift blame. They knew that 20 years ago she had stood on the second-floor balcony of a townhouse, fingers wrapped so tightly around another woman's bracelet that it left deep red marks in her palm. They knew that someone had fallen, and that no one had asked the right questions afterward. There was one letter that shook her more than the others. It came in the 4th week. Just 6 words, nothing else. She didn't fall. You let go. Eleanor stared at it for a long time before folding it carefully and slipping it under a dish on the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly, her lips parted but soundless. By then she had begun to dread Tuesdays, not for what they might reveal, but for how much she needed them. The letters were terrifying, yes, but also magnetic. They saw her. Not the version the town knew, elegant, controlled, gracious Eleanor, but the real one. The one she had buried beneath 31 years of domestic routine, polite lies, and curated grief. The letters exposed her, not with cruelty, but with clarity. There was something disturbingly intimate about being known so well. Around that same time, she started seeing him. A man. Always the same one. Tall, lean, mid-30s, with sharp features and green eyes that looked too familiar. She spotted him at odd moments. Outside the pharmacy, in the back pew at a church service she barely remembered attending, across the street from her home, just as the sun was going down. He never spoke, never moved toward her. He only watched. And yet he always vanished the second she looked away, as if the very act of acknowledging him caused him to dissolve. There was something in the way he stood, calm, deliberate, silent, that reminded her of Karen. Not the physical resemblance, but the presence. That same charged stillness Karen used to carry when she had something dangerous to say. Karen, who had once been her closest friend. Karen, who had trusted her with everything. They had met in college and grown inseparable. 2 ambitious girls in matching scarves, finishing each other's sentences. For years they were like sisters. Until Karen made the mistake of falling in love with the wrong man. Not just the wrong man. Eleanor's man. Her husband. It had started as flirtation. Then it turned into nights. Then it turned into a pregnancy. Eleanor found out not from her husband, he didn't have the spine, but from Karen herself, who came to her house, crying, ashamed, pleading. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen, that she still loved Eleanor, that she would go away, quietly. She just needed someone to know, someone to forgive her. Eleanor had listened, stone-faced, said nothing, her hands resting in her lap, one thumb softly brushing the other. When Karen stood up to leave, Eleanor followed. They stood out on the balcony for a moment. Rain was falling. Karen apologized one more time, and Eleanor pushed her. There had been no scream, just the wet thud of a body meeting concrete, and silence. The police called it a tragic accident. Karen must have slipped. There were no signs of struggle, and Eleanor wept beautifully, shaking hands, red eyes, whispering how they had been like sisters. No one questioned her. No one looked at the bruises on Karen's wrist. No one asked why she had shown up there that night in the first place. Eleanor had buried the truth like a keepsake. The bracelet she took off Karen's wrist was hidden in her drawer, beneath the scarves. The pregnancy? It was never spoken of again. Her husband never mentioned Karen's name after that night. In a way, he became a ghost too. Now, years later, someone remembered. Someone was digging through the layers she had so carefully laid. But Eleanor couldn't decide which thought was more terrifying. That someone out there had finally pieced it together, or that she had written every word herself in the dark and couldn't even remember doing it. After her husband's death, Eleanor dedicated herself to the role of the grieving widow with theatrical precision. She wore black, not out of custom, but as a uniform, a deliberate costume designed to elicit the right kind of pity. Her voice remained low, her expressions composed, and her hands always neatly folded in her lap like a woman trained in restraint. At church, she sat near the back, eyes lowered. In the grocery store, she declined small talk with a soft shake of her head. She became, in the town's collective imagination, a woman hollowed by loss, navigating each day with the delicate grace of someone carrying invisible weight. But behind closed doors, the performance unravelled in slow increments. The house, once silent in its decay, now felt animated by the presence of something electric. The letters had become more than just a curiosity. They were fuel. With each arrival, she felt more alive. The fear they should have instilled was overpowered by a sharper, more exhilarating sensation. Attention. Finally, someone was watching her again, not ignoring her, not looking through her, watching, thinking about her, writing for her. She had always needed that, an audience. Not crowds, not praise, but the intimacy of scrutiny. She didn't fear being exposed so much as she feared being forgotten. So when the whispers began, when someone at the post office mentioned the strange envelopes, when a woman from her bridge group asked softly if everything was all right, Eleanor let them grow. She offered just enough to keep them fed. She left one of the letters visible on the kitchen counter when her daughter visited. Folded, but not hidden. Her daughter noticed. Of course, she did. Eleanor pretended to be embarrassed, brushing it off with a tight smile and vague words about harassment and probably nothing. But it was enough. The concern in her daughter's eyes was like oxygen. Later, she casually mentioned to an old neighbour that someone had followed her from the market to her driveway. Nothing dramatic, just something off. A feeling. Within days, the town had its story. Poor Eleanor, the elegant widow, being stalked by someone from her past. She became interesting again. Pitied, protected, talked about in quiet tones over coffee. It was exactly how she liked it. The danger, the mystery, the fragile beauty of a woman who might break at any moment. But didn't. She played the role to perfection. And then there was the man. He had arrived in town not long after the funeral. His name was Michael. She met him at the pharmacy of all places, a bottle of aspirin between them, a polite conversation that extended itself unnaturally. He was 35, quiet, polite, with eyes that made her think of storm clouds, grey, unreadable. She invited him for tea once and he came, then again. Over time, they fell into something that looked like companionship. He never asked too many questions. She appreciated that. There was something familiar in him, though she couldn't place it at first. The tilt of his head, the precision with which he measured his words. He didn't flirt, he observed. And that, for Eleanor, was far more intoxicating. She learned his last name after several visits. Not from him, he never offered it, but from a discarded package he left in her trash. Ashcroft. Her stomach turned when she read it, though her face remained still. The name didn't belong to her husband, but it belonged to Karen. Karen Ashcroft. That had been her maiden name long before she became a secret. Michael never said he knew, and Eleanor never asked. But she started to watch him more closely. His silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate, measured, as if he too were playing a role, as if the two of them were engaged in a performance with no script, only subtext. She began to wonder, had he come to her by accident or by design? Still, she didn't send him away. She offered him tea, let him linger. In her mind, they were dancing, two people tangled in something neither fully named. But beneath her smile, beneath the tilt of her head and the press of her fingers to his hand, there was a growing awareness. The son of Karen and the man she called her husband sat across from her, sipping her tea, watching her closely. And she had invited him in. One morning, Eleanor decided to stop. No more letters, no more notes, no more carefully staged envelopes slipped into her own mailbox before dawn. She wanted to see what would happen. She waited a week. Nothing came. No one knocked. No shadow crossed her driveway. Not a single concerned message appeared on her phone. Even her daughter didn't call. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. It filled the house like thick dust, clinging to the curtains, creeping into her lungs. The stillness was not freedom. It was irrelevance. By the 8th day, she couldn't bear it any longer. She returned to the small desk in the back bedroom, the one she once used for thank you notes and holiday cards. She opened the drawer where she kept the special stationery, off-white, slightly textured, the kind that felt expensive. She reached for the fountain pen with the fine point, the one that made her handwriting look like something out of a bygone era. She uncapped it with reverence. She wrote slowly, deliberately, in the same tight, elegant script she had practiced as a girl. The strokes were clean, the letters unhurried. "You may stay silent, but I won't," she wrote. "It started with Karen. It ends with you." Then, after a moment's pause, she added one more word, soon. The act gave her a thrill she hated to name. It wasn't just the words. It was the power. The knowledge that even if no one was watching, she was once again directing something. She folded the letter neatly, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in the mailbox before sunrise. Then she waited. The following day, she returned to her role with new purpose. The letters grew darker, more cryptic, more charged. She crafted them like weapons, small paper blades she turned against herself with precision. She made herself gasp when reading them, even if no one was around to see. She left one tucked into a library book at the school where she worked. Another she dropped in the teacher's lounge, folded and stained slightly with tea for dramatic effect. She took a photograph of Karen from an old photo album, the two of them smiling at a lake, hair wet from swimming, arms around each other, and slipped it into her office drawer. When she discovered it during a meeting, she pretended to tremble. Someone noticed. Someone asked if she was all right. She nodded, breathless, as if she were too shaken to speak. Sometimes she left partial fingerprints on the envelopes, just enough to create ambiguity. Not full prints, not smudges. Hints. She imagined what a detective might see, evidence of someone afraid, someone trying to trace a threat. She toyed with the idea of taking a letter to the police, but stopped herself. Too soon, she thought. Let the tension build. She even installed a small security camera facing her porch. Not for safety, but for spectacle. She filmed herself collecting the mail each morning, hoping that one day the footage might become proof, if ever needed. The camera never caught anything unusual. No strangers, no late-night visitors, no shadows darting behind the hedges. Only Eleanor, each morning approaching the mailbox with the solemn grace of someone living under siege. But she knew the truth. No one else had touched those letters. No one had slipped them into place. No one else had written those words. No one but her. He knew. It was unmistakable in the way he looked at her during those final weeks. Long, quiet stares that held questions he never dared voice aloud. He didn't accuse her, not directly, but something had shifted between them. His silence was no longer the dull, apathetic withdrawal of a tired man. It was sharper, more deliberate. He had begun to remember. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to understand that the version of events he had accepted for years no longer fit. He started drinking again, but not the way he had in the past. This time there was no rage, no outbursts, no noise at all, just the slow, methodical consumption of liquor in the evenings, his face blank, eyes turned inward. He avoided her, not out of resentment, but as if in quiet awe of what she was. The bracelet had been the turning point, the one Karen always wore. Eleanor had told him she'd returned it to Karen's sister after the accident, but he had found ashes in the fireplace that didn't match the wood. Something metal warped and twisted in the coals. He began to see her differently, like a painting he had stared at too long, realizing too late that the smile was a trick of the light, the warmth only surfaced deep. He grew cautious around her, careful. He made a few vague calls, researched attorneys, looked at apartments on his phone late at night when he thought she was asleep. She wasn't. She knew what he was planning. She could see the outline of escape forming in his mind, the quiet rebellion of a man who had finally decided to stop pretending. He wanted to leave the house, tell the children, expose her, or at least unravel her carefully constructed world. And she could not allow that. She acted with the same precision she used to fold her linens or balance her checkbook. There was no passion in it, no hatred, just necessity. One night, she poured him a glass of wine. His favourite, a vintage he'd forgotten she kept. She crushed a sedative into powder, stirred until it dissolved, and handed it to him with a smile. He drank it. Whether he suspected or not, he said nothing. He fell asleep in the back seat of the car as she drove. She took the long road, the quiet one that twisted through the trees and ended at the old bridge, the one with the rusted railings and steep drop into the river. It was past midnight. No cars, no lights, just darkness and the soft hum of tyres on cracked asphalt. She stopped just before the bend, shifted the car into neutral and guided his hand to the steering wheel. She stood outside, watching through the windshield, the engine low and steady. Then she reached in, nudged the gas. The car rolled forward, slow at first, then faster, until it broke through the railing like it had always meant to. The splash was hollow and distant. She stood still, listening to the water settle. Then she walked home. By morning, she was a widow. The town mourned with her. No one questioned her version of the story. They spoke of fate, of heartbreak, of how cruel life could be. She cried when expected, nodded politely at condolences, thanked people for their support. They saw what she allowed them to see. A woman forged by tragedy, still standing. No one saw the truth. No one ever did. She didn't vanish. She didn't flee in the middle of the night or leave a note on the counter. Eleanor Bryce remained exactly where she had always been, right in the centre of her well-curated, unremarkable little world. The house still stood quiet and pristine, the roses in the front gardens still trimmed with surgical neatness, and the neighbours still spoke of her with that special blend of pity and awe, the widow, the survivor, the one who had endured so much. But Eleanor had stopped writing the letters, not because the impulse had died, but because she no longer needed to fake the tension. Now, she could simply bask in the discomfort she naturally created. People had begun to behave differently around her. They chose their words carefully. They watched her a beat too long. They crossed the street sometimes, politely, without knowing why. That was enough. Fear, after all, was just devotion dressed in darker clothing. She spoke often now, not to people, but to the mirrors in her home. She would sit in the hallway in the early hours of the morning, legs folded neatly beneath her, and murmur things to her reflection. Things like, "You were right to do it, and they never deserved your mercy." Her voice was calm, gentle even, like a mother soothing a child. The house, otherwise silent, echoed with these strange lullabies. On her dresser sat the wooden box, heavy and full. Inside were the letters, hundreds of them, all written in her own hand, some angry, some trembling with false hope, some pretending to be from her husband, some from Karen, some from a vengeful God. The words varied, but they all said the same thing in different voices. You are the centre. You are the truth. You are what remains. Late one night, as rain tapped against the windows and the air smelled like something old rotting in the walls, she wrote one final letter. She chose a heavy envelope, the kind used for wedding invitations. Inside, she placed a single photograph, an old Polaroid, slightly faded, with a faint fingerprint still visible in one corner. It showed Karen sitting on a picnic blanket, laughing. Her face was bruised, not dramatically, but visibly. The bracelet on her wrist gleamed in the sun. Behind her stood Eleanor's husband, caught mid-step, his hand resting too casually on Karen's shoulder. His smile was subtle, too subtle. A private joke passed between them that the camera wasn't supposed to catch. Beneath the photo, Eleanor tucked in a typed note. No handwriting, no traces, just plain words printed on thick paper. She told me she was pregnant. She told him too. He said it wasn't his problem, so I made it mine. No signature, no date. She folded the paper in thirds, slid it behind the photo, and sealed the envelope with a wax stamp she hadn't used in years. Then she wrapped it in tissue paper and walked to the church in the morning rain. She didn't go inside. She placed the envelope in the vestibule, tucked between two hymnals, and left. No one saw her do it. No one ever saw what she didn't want them to. The next day, she packed a small suitcase, just enough for a week or two, told the neighbour she was heading to a retreat. Time to rest, she said. Time to heal. She smiled when she said it, and her eyes didn't blink for a long time. She locked the door behind her, the roses stayed trimmed, the box of letters remained untouched on the dresser. And in the church, someone eventually found the envelope. They opened it. They saw. They didn't speak of it. But something changed after that. People talked less about Eleanor Bryce, and when they did, they lowered their voices even more, as if she were listening, as if she was still just around the corner, because Eleanor didn't vanish. She left the story exactly the way she had lived it, clean on the surface, rotten just beneath. And in her absence, the town finally understood what it had been living beside all along. Something cruel, something patient, something that smiled as it wrote the last word.